Hi everyone. So I'm gonna request Yanni to join into the live video.
Hi, Annie.
Hey, how are you, Prernaa?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Fine, fine. So delighted to
How's it
have
back
you.
in Cyprus?
What's that?
How's it back in Cyprus?
It's uh, it's with my garden. I'm trying to make my own little jungle back here, except no coconuts. Are we ready?
Yes. So I'm going to introduce you to everybody first. So he's the man behind the blue-green chalcedony, and which is trademarked and marketed by the name of Aquaprase. So there's an interesting story that I read about you, Yanni, today.
Yeah.
Uh, so when you were four, I read that you heard that Napoleon Bonaparte has given your great 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 grandfather a sword studded with jewels, and a piece of this treasure was said to be buried in his own backyard.
Right.
Tell me a little more about this. I was like, it just touched my heart when I read this.
Well, I'm blessed to come from a country and an island in particular, the island of Rhodes and Crete, both islands where I come from, which have a very rich heritage in the arts and treasures and everything else. Rhodes was the place where all the metal work was taking place back in the golden age of Greece. It was the
Yeah.
place of the Colossus of Rhodes. And funny enough, if you go to their museum, it's the first place that the loops, the gemstone loops, were ever
Yes.
discovered on the whole planet 200 years before Christ. If you go to their museum, they have six loops, diamond loops. I'm talking about round magnifiers that they use for manufacturing jewelry, looking at gems, all that kind of stuff. So the island of Rhodes was a playground of treasures. So, first of all, growing up there was already an asset for me, because everywhere I dug in those days, in the 60s and in the 70s, I found buried treasure. And it turns out that that sword was actually part of my heritage. That gentleman was on a
Wow.
ship which sank off the coast of Rhodes, and he basically was washed on the shores. The nuns got a hold of him, they recovered him, and I'll add some new stuff that people probably never heard. But his whole jacket was filled with gold coins and diamonds
Wow.
that he was using as trade with Basra. He was bringing pearls to Vienna, and
Wow, that's so
he
interesting.
almost sank on that ship because his jacket was so full. In those days, they used to sew the wealth, and because cash, they didn't have exchanges. They used to sew the wealth inside the jacket so nobody would pickpocket you, and you used to sleep with that. Well, that nearly killed him because he was sinking, and thank God he got a hold of a piece of wood and he drifted to the coast of Rhodes. So he so he was a general in the Austrian military, and he ended up being in a battle with Napoleon in the days that Napoleon was on the side of Austria. I haven't really checked the history that much, but basically, after the battle, Napoleon ended up taking this sword, and back then they didn't have things that were, let's say, like the things that you get, the prizes that you get, the medals.
Yeah.
So he took the sword, which was filled with arsenic, by the way. Napoleon had filled the sheath with arsenic so that if he wounded somebody with it, he would kill them. All right. So he took that sword and he cut it into four pieces, and that sword was gem embellished. It had rubies and sapphires and emeralds and diamonds everywhere, right? And that was passed on from generation to generation. And that was buried in my yard. And unfortunately, in World War II, a bomb fell on the lemon tree where we had a small treasure, what was left of what we had left from giving to the poor people, and the sword basically evaporated. You could say the bomb was very powerful, and so grandmother used to tell me the story. And what happened was as I was being fed the domadake, she kept telling me about the sword being in the yard. And of course, when I grew up, the first thing I did was dig up her yard. And I was like a mole, you know. There wasn't, if you can picture this yard with pristine roses and you know, Greek feta boxes filled with flowers and everything else. Uh, Grandma tried to keep the yard beautiful, and here comes little Yianni and with a shovel, and I had dug that whole place completely empty. Well, it turns out Grandma's house was built on an ancient cemetery, so I never found the sword, but the bomb actually caused the dirt to be moved,
Yeah.
and it exposed the cemetery underneath. So I was
Oh.
within half a meter of all the treasures that were there, and I found everything from gold coins to tear vases. This is really cute. Tear vases. My grandfather explained it to me. There were little vases that were buried with the dead Greeks because Greeks believed that tears were so precious that they used to hold them underneath their ears in times of joy and times of sadness, and not allow the tears to drop on the ground because the tears were precious. And when the people died, they were buried with their little tear vases. So that was, believe it or not, is you know, yes, I can talk about the beads and the agates and the necklaces and the gold coins and the silver coins that I found, and all the armaments, you know, all the bronze and things that I found underneath there. But the little tear vases was part of my growing up, bringing the romance into it, not just what was valuable, but also a piece of ceramic, having a story to it. It wasn't just a little vase, it was something which had depth to it. And that taught me how to associate in the future everything that I do with a story. And here we are talking about it to the whole world, you know. So anyways, I dug up all of Greece. I was very naughty. I used to bring unexploded World War II bombs to my house, not knowing what they were. We had the bomb squads, trying to hit the bullets so that they would explode on the other side. I was a bit of a Huckleberry Finn when I was young. I used to ride donkeys, and we used to have wooden swords and hit each other. And of course, God bless him, he's passed away now. But my friend Yianni, I remember he hit me with the sword, but he forgot to take a nail out from the front, and the nail got stuck into the skin of my head. Thank God. And I was running around with a donkey with a sword stuck on my head. These are the stories of childhood, you know. These are tough. These are tough days. That's why I know how to eat the things. I know people here, they are, they wouldn't know how to survive without rice and everything else. My mother, having survived World War II, she knows every kind of, let's say, botanical part of the mountains and the sides that we can eat. And funny enough, the other day I went on a walk with my daughter, and we were picking things from the ground that we could eat, and that was a source of vitamins. And I realized, you know what, you can leave me here in the middle of nowhere, and I'm not going to disappear. So it's good that this virus has come, because it's taught us a lot to go back to our roots and survival. And
I agree.
so my kids today, if I give them the carob, you know, the thing that the carob pod, that's actually where we got the carrots from, because the carob is actually, the seed from it is very similar to the weight of a carrot. So we grew up as kids, we didn't have sweets. We grew up eating those things, and we had all kinds of things that we were eating from the trees, and sorry to say, stealing lemons. And I mean, we didn't steal lemons. It would be one lemon hanging from the other side of the fence, and we'd take it, and we felt guilty about it. But yeah, definitely very
So
naughty.
those are the sweet memories of a lemon.
Yeah, and funny enough, this period reminds me of those times, because you know, it takes you back to how people survived in World War II. You know, not just only World War II, every terrible confrontation that we've had. So that basically, when I dug up all the island and then everything disappeared, of course, I was sent to medical school, because that's what Greeks do. They become either doctors, lawyers or whatever. And I tried it. I was EMT, fireman. I was, again, in all the fires and the adventures and hanging from helicopters and going on shipping, sinking boats and adrenaline rushes and all that kind of stuff. And I did that in Florida when I came to America as a volunteer. And then I realized, you know what? One day I was in Greece actually, and I had seen 3 people drown, and one lady who was an amazing swimmer jumped in and tried to save one person, and he drowned her as well. And I managed to pull her out. And when I tried to save her, I did, but sadly the system in those days didn't have that many paramedics. Once I got her going and she was almost alive, they put her on a helicopter without any EMTs or paramedics, and by the time she reached the hospital, she had passed away. That incident caused me a great change in my life, because I realized that I was there with her kids around me, crying, her husband, and dealing with what I know that the medics and the doctors are dealing with right now as we speak. And having been a part of that, I realized I didn't have what it took. I was too involved. I would never sleep at night. I had terrible nightmares. So even if you saved 10 people, the one you lost didn't allow you to sleep for the rest of the months. And that's when I realized one day I just 3 years of medical schools and all that kind of stuff, and EMTs. And one day I grabbed my things, jumped in the car, drove across America, and went to GIA. And I have been actually selling jewelry. I've been selling jewelry in the summers in Greece. Where Rhodes was a huge manufacturer of jewelry in those days, the filigree in particular.
Yeah.
And I grew up in that society we're talking about, 800 jewelers on a small little island. And so I grew up with all my friends and family manufacturing and seeing them with the torch and setting the little jewels. And of course, in those days, the jewelers were considered the lowlives of the industry, because only jewelers went into, people that were not educated went into this in the 60s and the 70s and the 50s. So people that never passed high school or whatever, they went into the arts. So this definitely was a big change for me, and I went against the grain, and then followed my heart from the time I was 7. And something that I don't share that often is that I'm a huge carver. I carve waxes, and it's my greatest love, more than gemstones. I love carving wax, and even though we have all these CAD things, I love to carve. So yeah, in the back here somewhere, I have a whole bunch of carvings.
We'd love to see it at some point in the conversation today.
Yeah. So that was, I think. When I speak to people, I know that each of us has our own journey. Some of us are waiters. Some of us are, when I was a teacher at GIA for 4 years, I had doctors in their 70s who retired come and take the course, because they were like me, except they never took that step in their 20s. They took the step in their 70s, but they said that they wanted to take gemology their whole lives, but they got forced into it because of family. And in their 70s, they came to GIA, and they were the best students, not because they were brilliant, but because they walked around with a smile the entire day, because they realized even in your 70s, 80s, they were doing exactly what they dreamt of doing their whole lives. And I love being a part of that, teaching these students that were children at heart, to become gemologists and finally fulfill their dream. So it was at GIA that I met my first Indian students, that I had my first basmati rice with a friend of mine, Manoj Goyal, who is in Pink City. He was my student, and he invited me to his house, and I got to see the Indian hospitality and smell this amazing, aromatic rice that I had never. I was used to Uncle Ben's and all the other stuff that's out there, and I had never seen such long pieces of rice in my entire life. And of course, the whole room was smelling, and yeah, I'm very blessed because teaching at GIA exposed me to all the cultures of the world, all the religions of the world. It taught me to love everybody, and yeah, and that was for me the beginning again to wanting to go visit all those different cultures around the world. So, you know, I am the gem explorer, as they say, but
Yes.
you know. I like to say that it's not a step that just happened 30 years ago. It happened, you know, when I was 6, 7 years old, you know, digging up for things. So I've been in this literally half a century. So, yeah.
So tell me a little about your journey. How did you get into mining and exploring gemstones? After GIA, did you directly get into mining, or how did that come
No,
around?
actually, the story goes as that uh, a friend of mine, Edward Bohm, who is the grandson of Dr. Gubelin from Rare Source, he was my partner in at GI in '88, and he introduced me to Bill Larson from Pala Gems, and Pala was huge in those days, as they are right now, into color, right? I mean, they were the kings of color in the U.S., and Bill was a walking encyclopedia. I mean, the guy's like a genius. And so Bill Larson basically, you know, well, let's not go back, but let's add something. I also love to cook. My grandmother, whenever the royal family would visit the island of Rhodes, she was very religious, so she cooked for the royal family of Greece in those days because she was so trusted. So I was blessed to be with her because she was very influential in my life, together with my grandpa, and I love the stories, including, funny enough, Judaism, without deviating. My grandfather taught me in before I was 10 about the Holocaust and everything else, and told me that it was real because Rhodes was the second largest population in Greece of the Jewish community, and so he taught me about the Holocaust, and of course, finding all the German helmets and finding everything became real. And my grandpa was an amazing guy, perhaps the greatest influence in my life. And so that was an important step for me because it basically, he told me about all this terrible things that happened on this island. And so when I came to America, my heart was very open towards the Jewish community, not just only the Jewish community, as I said, with Manoj and everything else, all the communities, every experience, you have to turn it into a positive, you know. So, so these things basically took me forward and allowed me to blend with those local communities to be able to do the things that I'm doing, you know. There was one part of the question I didn't answer, right?
No, so coming back to how did you get into mining?
Well, it turns out that Edward Bohm was one of those connections. So you have the Indians, you have the Jews, and now you have the Swiss American guy. And Edward introduced me to Bill Larson, who then took me to the mine. And going back to the cooking, I love to cook, and now Greek Easter is coming. I know most of the Indians are vegetarians, but it's like me asking you not to eat onions and garlic and potatoes. But so I decided to cook, let's say, to have a feast on the mine site. So we invited all the GIA people, all the big gem dealers, everybody was there, and we had over 100 people, and Bill, as a sign of gratitude for me spending the entire night at the mine, said, "Listen, by the time we come back, I will let you, while you're cooking the lamb, go through the tailings, and whatever you find, you keep." Well, Bill didn't know what a digger I am. He didn't know what experience I had doing this. And so the entire night with a flashlight and everything else, while the lamb was cooking, I was going through his tailings and finding these incredible pala pink tourmalines, you know, big crystals that were missed. I was really shocked, tremendously shocked that tailings could have so much gems inside. And I started filling up my pockets, but then after a while I was so heavy that I had to take everything back. I ended up getting a bucket. By the time I was done, when Bill came back, the entire bucket was filled with thousands and thousands of dollars of gems. I have to tell you, Bill was shocked when he saw the bucket, but he had to keep his word. And so that was, for me, an amazing moment. And it wasn't just a moment that turned me into rough gemstones and digging. It was also a moment that for the rest of my life allowed me to understand how people that are working with large-scale miners that go through the tailings are able to feed themselves by going through the tailings and finding things that others would have missed and providing an income. So, you know, all these experiences are not just one, it's several. Yes. You know, these are very deep experiences that take you even further. And a very big moment for me was when I was at GIA, when you speak about the mining, is that with Robert Weldon and Donna Durlam and Elise Mizurowski, working in the library, I volunteered to help catalog the Sinkanka's library, which was the greatest source of treasure books in the world. You know, here were these ancient books saying the names of ancient sources, places that, and I had to help catalog those. So that basically took me all over the world. You know, I used to open up these books from the 1400s, and we're talking about locations in particular areas, and I was, of course, photocopying everything. And funny enough, I did visit some of those ancient locations and did find gems. And I had it wasn't so much about that. It was actually about, it's like reading opens up your mind. This incredible treasure of gemology just opened up my mind to traveling the world and doing what Tavernier and you know, and Marco Polo did, and everything else. And so it's a lot of hard work that went into doing that. So yeah, that was what did it. And then the final thing that really kicked in, Bill took me to his at one of the shows, and then he gives me a tanzanite crystal when tanzanite wasn't really that big at that. It was just starting. So he gives me an unheated tanzanite, which had this incredibly strong clear prism going from blue to brown, you know, and I had never seen anything like that. I didn't even understand the magic of gemstones. We're used to glass, we're used to these things, but I had never seen something that you just move in your hands a little bit and it flips over from blue to brown. I had never seen that. That was, for me, magic. And I swear I sat the entire night looking at that crystal in my bed, looking up, turning it back and forth. I think I turned it like a couple thousand times before I fell asleep, you know. So when I realized the magic of gems and God in that particular way, and how these things were so incredible in terms of the magic that they had within them, that little tanzanite crystal made me realize that, you know, I was in love. So that was the beginning of the rough thing. And then, of course, I started working for Swarovski. And Swarovski came to GIA, and I was broke. And this is a very famous story. Mr. Swarovski himself came there, and I didn't know who he was. And I used to help students after school at GIA because when I came to America in the 70s, American teachers helped me to let's say, learn English, and they used to stay with me after, you know, every day after school and help me catch up. So when I became a teacher, not so much the Indian students, but the Asian students in particular, the Japanese and everybody else that was coming there that could read but couldn't understand, I decided that that I wanted to give back, and I was threatened to be fired because I became too popular with the students, because because none of the other, at that time, I had the free time to do it, and I had the giving back attitude. But the other teachers were not, and even to this day, they weren't. That was their free time. Why would they stay with students after school? It was my personal choice. But when you do things like that, they're good and bad, because first of all, they're good for the students, but it makes the other teachers look bad. And so it wasn't meant on purpose, but I just couldn't allow students to fail when I knew that their parents and they themselves had saved so much to come there. They couldn't go back as failures. So helping some of those students, one day I used to put underneath so that the other teachers could not see that I had students helping them out. So at 5 o'clock, I let the students out, and I met Mr. Swarovski. Again, there's a reason for this. You're doing something good, right? And you're broke, and you're calling your mom up and saying, look, I have no money left, sort of like a lot of us are right now during this virus. And you don't know, because you live from month to month and everything else, and you're in debt. And then you walk out, and mom says, I'll make a prayer for you. And then I walk into the school bookstore, and I see this tall guy, and I say, can I help you? And he said, I want to find books. And I started helping them. He said, I want to cut synthetics. And I said, oh, come on, please. Why would you want to cut synthetics, when you can cut natural stones? And so I showed him Kurt Nassau's book on synthetics. And then, of course, I brought him to Sinkanka's book, which was on cutting gems. And then he said, I said, what do you do? He says, I'm an engineer. And he said, what do you do? He asked me. I said, I'm a teacher, at GIA. So I said, listen, you're an engineer where? He says, Swarovski, not knowing that this was Mr. Swarovski. Yeah. So I said, what's your name? He said, Helmut. And I said, nice to meet you, Helmut. And he said, listen, I said, why don't you go to your boss and tell him to start cutting natural gemstones? And I said, by the way, does he pay well? Because I'd be interested in a job right now. He started laughing, and he says, I think he pays pretty well. And but he says, I don't want to go to my boss and look bad. Are you sure you could do this and source the rough gemstones? I said, look, all my students are all the children of miners and everything else. So I'm connected to every country in the world. So, and I said, by the way, whoever your boss is, he's really stupid, because he bought Zales. And he looked really shocked, because I didn't know he was the boss. And in those days, they lost over 500 million buying Zales. And, anyways, it turned out it was his cousin who did it. He was against it. It's a long story. So let's focus on the Aquaprase. But that was very detrimental, because he took me from GIA and gave me the opportunity to travel all over the world, expenses paid. And I have to say that there's a lot of guys out there now that are digging, and I'm happy that they're doing that, because I'm actually going the other way around. I'm going back to designing jewelry. But I have to say that apart from the ancients and the Gobelins of the world, the first person that, let's say from at least my generation, that started going to the mines and making a story out of it, not as an academic, but as a person trying to romance the gemstones. There were not that many people, or if anyone, that I can remember that had that Indiana Jones image that originally started. I have to say, I'm more proud of that than I am at discovering the Aquaprase. Because in those days, I realized that it was important to have an image and to associate romance of the source by photographing where the gemstones came from, not just by showing a Colombian emerald, but also showing the nature and everything else around it. So whenever I gave a gift to somebody, a piece of rough, I always gave it with a stack of photographs from where the mine came from, and I realized, wow, people love to look at the gemstone in the pictures, and they love that. And so I started documenting all the mines, over 30 years ago. So that was the beginning. And then I realized I started making photographs with some really, I don't want to say touristy shirts, and then I realized, you know what, you have to have an image. That image is, of course, in me because when I was young, I was already like that. But then I met old timers like the original, let's say, explorers. But they were not explorers of the world. They were explorers of particular areas, like Yasun Papas in Africa from the ruby mine. He always wore khaki shorts, khaki shirts, and the African shoes, you know, that they wear, this particular pair of that Bata makes. And so I realized every morning when I woke up with Yasun, that's what he wore. And he was in the middle of the jungle. Nobody saw him. He didn't do it for films. He didn't do it for anything. He did it for himself. And so that was a part of the whole association. Let's move on. I'm going to have some coffee too.
So I'm going to ask you about this beautiful gemstone.
Yes.
So I'm going to put a little light on it so people can see. Yes.
Yes.
How did this happen and how did you discover this?
Well, I've tried to minimize the credit that I've received because I'm a firm believer that, and I've said this in other past interviews, is that just because you are at the mines and you discover something and your skin is white doesn't necessarily gives you the claim to the discovery. Because everywhere in Africa, I'd like to think of myself as like the relay team. Everybody participates in that win. It's not just only the person that crosses the finish line, but also the people that pass on the baton to you that were part of it. So when you're exploring, a great gem explorer doesn't take a week trip or even a 10-day trip. Most of my journeys have been no less than a month, and most of my journeys are several months. And several years. I mean, in several countries, I've lived 4 years. I've lived in India. I mean, if you live in India,
for very long, yeah.
If you live in India, you know things like Lasiwala. You know a lot of things that a lot of people wouldn't know. All right, and Sharma Darba and butter naan. So,
yes.
So you don't do that by going there for a week and saying that
you spend months in Jaipur. I know.
Spend months and you live the culture. And so Aquaprase was part of an African effort, all of us together. I was in this particular case, the intellectual that looked at it and knew that it was something different. Okay. We were in a very, very, I can't mention the source because we try to protect the people that own the mines. I don't own the mine, but I definitely protect them from people that try to steal from it and everything else.
Yeah.
And so I saw it, and having seen, I don't want to say millions of stones, but having spent over 30 years, tracking and looking at things, including my days from GIA, 4 years of having access to this incredible treasure in our safes that had samples from every part of the world, including, the 10,000 books from the Sinkankas that we got to see pictures and read about things. When I saw that gemstone, it was several factors when I saw Aquaprase that told me it was different. And I couldn't quite fathom what the reason was because there was no scientific reason. There was just something that tells you that something isn't right, but in the case is right. You know what I mean? It doesn't fit.
Yes.
And it's when you Google something and you Google a particular something and nothing comes out, So that's what happened. I Googled it within my brain, which has seen a lot, and it spit out nothing. So when I was sitting there looking at it, not knowing what to think about it, I realized that it was something different. And I got goosebumps when that happened. And when I sent it to one of the Swiss labs, which we won't mention because they're friends of mine, the most famous lab in Switzerland at the time, they called it chrysoprase. And being very stubborn, as you know I am, and very outspoken, I refuse to take the advice and the professional opinion of these scientific people and their machines. And I stuck with my gut feeling that you have to trust. And I said, this is not chrysoprase. And so we took it to GIA, and what happened is Nathan, who was one of the gemologists there, he ended up discovering that it was a brand new gemstone. So, and if you look at the Rentro's article, if you just Google GIA and Aquaprase, you will actually see then that it was actually named blue-green chalcedony, and even back then in 2015, marketed under the name Aquaprase, because I wanted to come up with a name that would protect it from all the dyed chalcedonies and stuff, the opals and everything else that people were trying to sell. And so I decided to call it Aquaprase for my own jewelry collection in the future. But 5 years later, everybody has designed something with it except for me, and that's my nature. I love when other people do things. I'll be the last person. I'm the designer. I'm the person who came up with it. And at that time, I said, "Wow, wouldn't it be great if I created a collection? It'd make me famous right away, you know, as a designer." And all these changes, they take time. And if you try and think for your friends versus for yourself, I loved every time a designer, rather than being jealous or something, I just loved when other designers came up with amazing designs. And of course, I'll be the last one to use Aquaprase as a designer. But anyways, let's hope that my artistic capabilities are above the gemstone that I discovered. So, yeah.
So I'm going to tell you to design the cabochon you sent for me as well.
Well, funny enough, if you ask me what my greatest discovery is, it's not actually Aquaprase. It is the element that I will use in my designs, and I don't want to let go of anything, but it's very historical, and it has to do with my culture, and it has to do with water. It has to do with the Acropolis. It has to do with columns. It has to do with all these things, and because I learned from David Yurman, who's one of my great mentors and an amazing friend. That you have to have an element that you have to use consistently in order to be associated with a particular design. And of course, David was the king of that. He came up with the rope design, and he's an amazing human being above being a great designer, because I like to say that he taught a lot of the youth how to design and how to look for those elements. And I think he was probably the first who had that really strong identity with an element. And so although we worked together as friends 8 years, you know, in the Plato philosophy, you know, we say, you know, we pass on things, and I'd like to be able to always look back and say that Mr. Yurman was definitely a great influence in my life in teaching me these things. And so I'm extremely grateful to him, you know.
I love seeing his designs too.
Yeah.
I mean, especially the men's jewelry is phenomenal.
Well, that's actually, you know what? I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but this is his son. His son is an amazing designer, and he works together with his son, and I have a very strong feeling that the future of Yurman is going to be amazing under the son's guidance, you know, because we all get old. We all look forward to, I have 2 kids. You know, you always sort of wish, although you don't dictate, that one of your kids will follow up and be greater than you are. That's our wish, you know. I always say that your legacy that we leave behind is the greatest thing you can leave for your children. And if people can look back, you know, my family in particular, and say that they were proud of what I did or laid the foundation, I think David and I, having spent so many years together, we're probably very similar in that. But you know, I just wanted to add to that that is a very strong team. Sybil, to me, is Sybil Yurman is perhaps one of the least recognized people that I know of in the jewelry industry, because she has been a huge part of the design of David Yurman, and she has always been in the background purposely. She does it. She's not an egocentric person. She always lets David shine. But that those three individuals, son, mother, and father, are an amazing team. So sorry we deviated, but you know, that's been a great influence on me.
So coming back to Aquaprase, what
Yeah.
are the typical characteristics and the colors that are available in Aquaprase?
Yeah, well, first of all, the Aquaprase. Somebody sent me a question the other day about the gem quality. There is a quality that is very gemmy, and it's really transparent and green blue, and it's been trademarked as gem jelly, and gem jelly is the ultimate, let's say, best quality. It's got nothing inside. It's just pure blue green and very transparent. That's the rarest that there is. But what's funny is that although Avon Chordia, who is he's a great hero. He took a gemstone that I came up to him and said, I think you should invest in this, because obviously I'm a gypsy. I'm the Caribbean guy, the guy who goes in the pirate ships and is always somewhere in one part of the world. But Avon is a business guy, and he came up to me and said, "Look, I'd like to work with you somehow. What do you think we should invest in?" And I said, "Well, listen, I've given this gemstone to a few people, but they've turned it down because it's not that clean. It's got all these swirls of color and all this earthy looking stone. But I believe in that. I believe in that more than the gem quality. And being a very young guy and not, let's say, although a master in the emerald business, he wanted to create something that was different for his legacy. And so he took me up on that, and Avon, who's under the name Aquaprase on Instagram, he invested heavily into it. I didn't even invest a penny. I kept the rights to the trademark, but it's his business, and we started cutting it and doing all kinds of stuff. And what we found out is that the gem quality wasn't as popular as the material, which was like what he calls the candy, the stuff with all the patterns in it that reminds of the earth. And actually, it wasn't that I discovered it. I knew that from the beginning, because 95% of the material that comes out of the mine looks like that. And that's why the initial investors were not interested in that. But knowing that the world was going towards something more organic and something that was more individual, and being an artist and a designer, I knew that this gemstone would be a success. And so what he did is just he's a very simple, down-to-earth person, which did very well with all the artists and everything else. And he didn't treat the stone. He kept it natural and everything else. And so that started working with several designers. Now they're working with Levian and different people, and I wish them well. And he's done an amazing job. It's not just only discovering the gemstone, you have to make a business out of it. So that natural patchwork, and if you ask me a question about how you grade it and how you do that, there isn't really an answer to that, because I've seen stones that are just gray with a little tiny little blue area there, and people go nuts and they fight over it. I've seen people that fight for the blue-green, and I've seen people fight for the green-green. And then, of course, I see people that collect all of it. They want everything. They want to have a piece of everything. So he's done very well with it. And I would say that he's mastered the art of cutting it, which is a very difficult stone to cut, by the way. It's extremely durable. When we cut it, you can go under my Instagram and see that there's actually one video where you can actually see the fire coming out of it. And we found out initially from the guys drilling the beads that this was not your ordinary chalcedony, that the time that it was taking to drill the beads was far more, and the guys drilling the beads were complaining to to Avon that it was taking them more time to drill it, so they wanted more time. The guy slicing it, who sliced all kinds of chalcedonies and all kinds of gemstones, also found it hard to slice, so they were complaining how long it took. And then when I was at the mine, I discovered one area from the miners. They showed me a piece of rock that was exposed for, I could say, hundreds and hundreds of years to the sun.
Okay.
And this because all this began after we found the initial piece, you know, all the mining and the you know, so that particular piece I had not seen when I was there. But we found one piece that had been sitting in the sun for hundreds of years, all right? And the piece is exactly the same color as you would see the gemstones today, which is very rare to see something under the sunlight kills everything. And and so most of the material that's being cut today is from 2013, 14, 15. And so all that stuff is not faded. It hasn't cracked like opals and other things. So it doesn't fade. If you look at some of these blue-green chalcedonies that are dyed, you know, they start getting a white powder over them and they start fading and everything else. So, you know, the durability plus the color, which is a very pleasant blue-green, is what's caused the success of this gemstone. It looks a little bit like Makhariaa. It looks a little bit like, you know, it looks like emerald at times. It depends on which light you're looking at it, you know. So extremely durable, untreated. And if you look at it under the spectroscope, you get fine lines in the red area versus a broad, you know, band that you would get with dyed material. And and plus, if you see it, you see the white and the green, you know, it's impossible to dye those pieces the way that the patterns are. And people are just falling in love with it. And let's think about it. It is relatively new. The explosion of Aquaprase has been amazing. Think about chrysoprase. This goes back to Alexander the Great when he wore the belt buckle and it was his favorite stone. I like to think that if Alexander the Great was still alive, he'd throw away the chrysoprase and wear the Aquaprase. But this gemstone has been discovered since I discovered it in December of 2012. The story came out in, I believe it was winter. Nathan Renthrow came up with the article at GIA winter 2015. So it's only been 5 years. I mean, really think about it. And nobody has invested any money except for a few designers in marketing it. So it's been very explosive, and I think the reason is because people got sick of all these things that were very, you know, the usual rubies and sapphires and emeralds, everything looking perfect, and people wanted to wear something fun that wasn't so expensive, and a lot of designers wanted to focus around the individuality of the piece. And when people say about, you know, well, there's a lot of designers using it. Well, you know what? Rubies is used by millions of people. You know, the advantage of Aquaprase over a ruby, for example, or an emerald or anything else is that that particular pattern is one of a kind. So whoever has it, 1,000 pieces, 1,000 different designs, and that particular piece is yours. And I think that's why people love the Aquaprase, is because they feel it's individual to them. So that's I'm helping now support all the designers out there that are selling the Aquaprase. You know.
So talking about hardness, as you mentioned that it was difficult to cut, what would we scale this on the Mohs scale for hardness?
Well, based on, we haven't done any scientific evidence, but based on the hardness, it's above 7.5. But we do know that it's harder than most of the chalcedonies based on the drilling and the slicing. So it's extremely durable. It isn't like Larimar. People, you know, Larimar, I don't know what is the hardness of Larimar. It's like, I mean, you can scratch it with your pen, you know. I mean, you can't do that with Aquaprase, you know. So it is an extremely durable gemstone. And not only that, but it's got this amazing transparency and these little drusies inside of it. And it's got something which is very unusual, which is called moganite. And it's not morganite, it's moganite. And if we have time, I'll show you the graph where you can actually, see the graph of Aquaprase. And if you want to Google it, just Google the GIA article, GIA and Aquaprase, and you will see the article there, and it shows you the graph how it's completely different than chrysoprase and chrysocolla. Yeah. So.
So, moving forward, most of your talks have been around ethical mining and sourcing. Can you tell us a little more about it? I know that's something very close to your heart.
That's a loaded question. Well, you know what? I might as well talk about it because I think the reason that I haven't sold my jewelry until now is because I never wanted to be perceived as a person selling something, right? And pitching something. In other words, here we're doing this interview. I don't have a piece of jewelry that I can refer you to sell. So I think the reason that I've waited all these years is because I felt like I wanted to invest in doing something good for society without it being perceived as something that is associated with sales. Yes. So, if you're in the diamond business or whatever, and you start pitching something or whatever you do, even if it's in good intention, people are going to associate you with trying to sell something. And that's very difficult. Like for me, I, the other day, decided to honor Aquaprase by associating it with all the medical staff in the nursing community. There's a deep meaning behind that because I have been there. I have been in their shoes. I've been there having to choose between 5 people and who do you save and who's the old person versus the young person. And I used to be a fireman EMT going into flaming buildings and having to choose who I was going to carry out. So I decided to dedicate it not only because of this period of time, but also because I have nothing to gain from it. I'm not even the owner of the material. I'm going to have to struggle in the future to create my own collection, and move from the identity of the gem explorer to being the designer. So yes, if you look at the color, it's also associated with nursing. If you look at it, the reason that they wear these colors, these blue-greens, is because it's very soothing to the eye. I mean, if you saw a nurse coming in with a red gown, it would be a little bit scary, But these colors are very soothing. That blue-green color is very soothing, and that's why Aquaprase has done amazing.
Yeah, like I have one here with, it has a tinge of lavender in it.
That's right. That one is the fluorescent one, okay? That has a fluorescence to it. That's not actually a color. That's a very rare occurrence in Aquaprase, that it actually starts to fluoresce, So it's like in diamonds, you get a visual fluorescence, and this one even more. But I felt like I started when we started working with children with disabilities. We found out that the nursing care. This was I decided to come out with this and talk about it because Avant has been very good. I mean, whenever I call them up and say there's a lady that's working with kids, please send her a free necklace. I mean, that's his money, But he's been very kind and never once even flinched to say. But when we tried working with people with kids with disabilities, and even on TV when I go on air, I get letters from different parts of the world of people that are not associated with each other. I keep those letters, and they all say the same thing: that kids with disabilities somehow get soothed by the colors of Aquaprase. And this has been an amazing feeling for me because I realize it's not just only a gemstone, but it calms them down. And these are kids. These are not crystal gurus that are trying to sell you something. These are parents of kids that have already bought something, and they're just sending a message saying, thank you very much. We really are grateful because my son, before I couldn't calm him down, he's just fascinated with the Aquaprase, and it helps him. That's like the best letters you can ever receive in your entire life. So, I gave it to the medical community because I felt like they have earned it, and I've dedicated to them. And one day when you go under Wikipedia, you'll see, apart from all the other facts, that it was dedicated to the medical community during the coronavirus period.
Wow.
Yeah.
How interesting is that?